I suspect and I fear that the next war will be a much more intense, high casualty event from the very outset.
Your thoughts on the UN Security Council so far?
On the Council?
Or the UN
On the
General Assembly?
Well, I mean,
General
the
Assembly?
issue I've been following the closest is Israel, Palestine, and Gaza. And I think I counted 9 countries that not only are speaking very forcefully on this issue at this point, but are also using the word genocide. I think it was 4 or 5 last year. And that's my count so far. I think there's been quite a few more since then. But even outside of that, the tone is very, very different from last year. The question, of course, is that was this just be symbolic things, particularly the recognition, or will it have created not only a momentum, but also a degree of expectation that will make it very difficult and costly for countries to not follow through, ensure that they're doing actually something practical to be able to put an end to what is going on over there. And in some ways, the fact that this has become so big compared to what people expected, and the fact that they made this investment in recognition that many criticize for just being symbolic, well, it's become quite big, and I think that has raised expectations that they have to do much more following this, so it cannot just stop here.
Yeah, but do you really think it will make a difference? Like, I think the plans to annex Gaza are looking more and more likely, and then you've got the same happening in the West Bank. Israel's pretty adamant and a lot more vocal about not wanting a two-state solution, pretty much under any circumstances. The polls in Israel are not too promising either. Is it because you've got the red line being drawn by Saudi and the UAE, for example, just a couple of weeks ago? But I worry this is just to please their citizens rather than genuine red lines. And in terms of the UN, you've got those leaders trying to hedge against the inevitable by the looks of it. I know I seem pretty pessimistic, but that's only in the last few months. I was a lot more optimistic not long ago.
Look, pessimism is not unwarranted in this situation, undoubtedly, and much of what you said may very well end up becoming the case. I think, however, that we also have to understand that if Israel continues on this path, and this is a trajectory towards essentially permanent pariahhood, that is not going to be sustainable for Israel itself. Yes, it might be able to take more land, control it for a period of time, but it will not be able to sustain that type of situation. In fact, one thing that I'm very, very surprised by, and I've studied Israel for quite some time, I wrote my dissertation on it, is that after the 1990s, when Oslo first came into place, one of the critical things the Israelis were looking for, and one of their measurements of success, was how integrated and accepted they would be politically and economically throughout the world. We tend to forget, but it's not until the early 1990s that Israel actually had relations with a large number of countries, including giants such as India. It all happened because of Oslo. Now, however, you have the Israeli prime minister talking about super Sparta, essentially embracing pariahhood, embracing and celebrating what is going to be a long standing situation of isolation for Israel, potentially getting kicked out of a lot of sporting and cultural events. One can make the argument that, look, this doesn't bite, etc. Studies have shown that one of the most effective measures against apartheid South Africa was actually not the economic measures, not to say that they were unimportant, but it was South Africa's exclusion from sporting events that actually had a much greater bite with the average citizens. And I don't think that Israel is the type of a country that will in the long run be able to cherish any form of isolation.
Yeah, but it took over a decade and we're going to start talking about Iran, which is probably the main focus that we have right now and probably the most concerning development that we could see over the next couple of months. But just focusing on Israel, will it really have an impact when you have an ally like the US, an unequivocal ally like the US? And could we see that alliance shift? We're seeing a bit of a split in MAGA, but it hasn't really, at least on the outside, hasn't really shown to have impacted Trump's resolve and support for Israel in any way. So having an ally as the biggest military and the biggest economy in the world, that could be enough for the country to survive, all these different repercussions from other countries.
You're quite right that, the relationship with the United States is actually the key reason as to why the Israelis have been able to go this far. I mean, they are, by the account of all of these human rights organizations, UN commissions, etc., conducting a genocide and by and large getting away with it. That would not be possible had it not been for the political, military, and economic support of the United States. But you are also right. There are things changing in the United States, particularly on the conservative side. We've already seen the change happening on the Democratic side. 15 years ago, there was an expression called progressive on everything except Israel. And I would say that 5 years ago, there was also an equivalent of that, which was to be a restrainer or be a realist on everything but Israel or asterisk Israel. I think that is changing dramatically right now, not just because individuals like Tucker Carlson and Steve Bannon and the voices that they have, which are massive in that world, but also because there's a demographic shift that I have a very hard time seeing shifting back. When you take a look at these protests at the campuses last year, MIT, Columbia, Harvard, etc. These are not community colleges in the United States. These are the future elites of the United States. One of them is going to run for president. 10 of them are going to serve in the Senate. 50 of them are going to be members of Congress. And for them, this has been a formative experience, much as the Vietnam War was a formative experience for that generation. It's not going to shift back easily. And this is going to cost the Israelis, I think, a tremendous amount, which will make it much more difficult.
But that's in 10, 20.
It could be 5 to 10
that's
years.
10, 20
It
years
could be,
time, though.
certainly,
Between now and
certainly,
then.
absolutely. These are not quick fixes in any way, shape, or form. Undoubtedly, I agree with you. But do also keep one thing in mind. Already we have now one election in which there is data, arguably, Biden lost it to a large extent because of his support for Israel in Gaza. You had Kamala Harris essentially referencing that in her new book as well. The polls have shown that of the supporters of Biden who voted in 2020 for Biden, but decided to stay home in 2024, they didn't go out and vote for Jill Stein or for Trump. They stayed home. They boycotted the election. 29% of them, the plurality, did so because of Gaza. So you're already starting to see that this is having a political cost. It is tremendously unsatisfactory, I agree with you, to see that it's not having the impact right now, given the tremendous difficulties and the suffering that is happening in Gaza right now. But if we're looking at trend lines, which I think is the basis of your question, I think those trend lines are pretty clear.
So what we could do now is we could focus a bit more on Israel, because that will obviously naturally help us pivot to Iran and the war that we could see in a couple of months. Can you tell me your thoughts on, because you've studied Israel for a very long time, how surprised were you by their successes in Yemen, in Lebanon, and obviously in Iran? Would you call them successes? Because obviously some people challenge me that they didn't even succeed, as some would like them, to kind of paint it. I've seen it as an incredible success. I was just shocked at those precision strikes in Lebanon, unlike Gaza, which were, in my opinion, definitely not precision strikes, and the ability to decapitate the leadership in both countries. And in Lebanon, they've done it in a way not to alienate the Lebanese population. Iran less so, but in a way turning them against Hezbollah. So I just think politically and militarily, they've just had such immense success. And from the intelligence perspective, it's just been, everyone talks about the capabilities of Mossad. They've proven themselves over the last few decades, but I think this takes it to another level. Would love to get your analysis of it. And what does that say about Israel's military capabilities, and comparing them to other superpowers in the region, Turkey, Egypt, even Saudi now with the Pakistani alliance? I know I've kind of thrown a lot of points together.
Those are very good questions, though. So there's a couple of things we have to separate out: intelligence successes and military successes or capabilities. I would say that undoubtedly Israel, after having faced a humiliating intelligence failure on October 7th, went all out to try to make sure that they made up for that essentially and restored the deterrence capability of Israel's intelligence services. And what Israel did in Lebanon in particular was a rather decisive strike. It's not taking out Hezbollah entirely in any way, shape, or form, but it was a dramatic weakening of that organization. Now, having said that, I think we also have to admit that some of these successes are not just because of intelligence, what to call it, qualities, etc. But it's also because you have a scenario in which the restrictions that the United States used to put on Israel, and perhaps Israel also put some of them on itself, on what it is permitted to do and what it is not permitted to do, have completely been taken off. So, for instance, look at what happened in 2006. In 2006, the Israelis on 2 occasions tried to assassinate Nasrallah during that war, and they hit his bunker, but they could not penetrate the bunker. They couldn't penetrate it. Sorry,
He was there?
He was there.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So he was there, but they failed to kill him. He was in the bunker. It was not because they didn't have the firepower. It's because of the rules that existed of how much firepower you can use and how much collateral damage can you afford. In 2024, however, there was no restrictions, and they used about 80 bombs, 2,000 pounds, blew up an entire neighborhood, probably killed 300 to 500 people to take out one guy. In 2004, when the Israelis assassinated Sheikh Yassin, who was the founder of Hamas, they killed, I think, 9 or 10 of his relatives. The Bush administration condemned it because of a large number of collateral kills. Whereas in 2024, when they killed 300 to 500 people just to take out Nasrallah, the Biden administration issued a written congratulations to Israel. So we have to keep in mind, it's not just the fact that they had intelligence successes. It's also that all restrictions, all norms of what you are allowed to do, not allowed to do, how much civilians are you allowed to kill, those have more or less been taken away. And as a result, Israel has, we've seen Israel, in Gaza, how they're killing with almost no limitations whatsoever. And also in the case of Lebanon, there was that. It's not as visible. It is not as, the extent of it, of course, is not the same in any way, shape, or form compared to Gaza. But this is a very, very critical element. That is not to take away that obviously they had some dramatic intelligence successes. This also goes back to what they did in Iran when they took out one of the heads of Hamas during a presidential visit. So, I mean, clearly they have had a tremendous amount of successes in terms of penetrating Iran, penetrating Hezbollah, etc. But the reason why we're also seeing some of these things come to fruition is because there's no holds bar. The rules of war, that rule book has more or less completely been thrown out.
I think the point you've made, the comparison you've made to when they killed the Hamas leader under Bush, and Bush criticizing the amount of casualties, civilian casualties, I think it was 8 or 9, and this time in the hundreds, it kind of makes me question the precision strikes comment I made earlier about Lebanon. I would still use it if you compare to Gaza.
Yeah.
Obviously,
I think the strategy in Lebanon, I think to a certain extent that you're right, that they were particularly going after Shia Lebanese. Now, was that because they didn't want to alienate the others? Was that because they were trying to turn everyone against Hezbollah? Or was it because they were sowing the seeds for a potential civil war? The push right now to have the complete disarmament of Hezbollah, I think that there's a tremendous amount of folks in Lebanon that would like to see that, but they would like to see that on Lebanon's time schedule through an integration of the Shia in order to make sure that you actually have a unitary Lebanese army, not on the time schedule of Israel or the United States, which is pushing matters towards a civil war in Lebanon that would be devastating for all.
Oh, okay. So that's a big comment. Like, I'm very critical of what's happening in Gaza. I've been very vocal about it. But obviously the West Bank. But in Lebanon, Iran less so. But in Lebanon, I've been more optimistic, but also more understanding. So Hezbollah struck Israel first. Hezbollah is a threat to Israel. So Israel striking Hezbollah, for me, there's a good argument to be made in support of that decision. Obviously, I'm very nuanced on my position on the matter. But the question I've asked a lot of people, including Tom Barak, is whether Israel's aiming to have, kind of another Syria on the border with Lebanon and to keep Syria the way it is, or they prefer to have stability in those countries and normalize relations. If you compare to what we saw in Jordan and Egypt, I think it's a pretty good argument to be made that Israel benefits more from normalizing relations and having stability on those two borders. It's unlikely they want to annex more Lebanese and Syrian territory. Obviously, the territory they've invaded since the October 7th could be disputed. But beyond that, I think it's hard to argue that Israel wants to take more territory. A lot of Lebanese are worried that's the case. But I want to understand your stance. Is Israel looking to keep those countries weak to take even further territory? or they will prefer to have another Egypt and Jordan on those two borders. I really hope you choose the latter. And Tom Barak was a lot more optimistic. Now he's leading the negotiations, so obviously he needs to be optimistic, but he seemed pretty sincere in my interview. I know a lot of people dislike him, but he's in a pretty tricky position, and it's really nice to hear him be optimistic and say that Israel is not looking to invade. He kind of played on words a bit, but I think from what I understood, it's not looking to invade more territory in Lebanon. That's what I understood.
So look, let me just clarify. This is not my stance. I'm providing you with my analysis. If the facts change or if someone comes with better evidence, my analysis and conclusion will hopefully change. But my analysis at this point is that it's valuable, the comparison that you've made to Jordan and Egypt. But I think it's also very important to understand that these are countries that are wholly dependent on the United States for their security. And Israel has a much stronger relationship with Washington than any of these countries have. That's indisputable. So as a result, Israel does not have the same concern about those countries. For Syria or Lebanon to be in that category, they first need to be states that are so dependent on the United States that Israel can be more comfortable with them, which essentially means what Barak actually said, and I think in a different interview, which is we're not arming the Lebanese army in order for it to be able to have a deterrence against Israel. We're arming and helping it in order to fight its own in Lebanon. And that's the name of the game. The United States approach has been to ensure that Israel has a qualitative strategic edge in the region. No one in the region, particularly those countries bordering Israel, should be able to have a deterrence or an ability to pose a threat to Israel. That is essentially what has happened with Lebanon, with Jordan and Egypt, even though Egypt, of course, has a stronger army, but nevertheless, because of the dependency on the United States, it would be suicidal for them to try to do anything. Israel has already taken territory in Syria. It has taken territory that is almost larger than that of Gaza in Syria. And that is in addition to the Golan Heights that it has been occupying for some time. And when they occupied the Golan Heights, it said that this was a temporary move as a buffer zone. Now it is taking another buffer zone in order to have a buffer zone for its old buffer zone. So to say that that is not expansionist vis-a-vis Syria is perplexing in my view. Lebanon may be quite different, but their challenge there is that they know that they're going to have a great difficulty rooting out the animosity and the enmity that exists between the Shias, at least in Lebanon and in Israel. I think we have seen clear evidence at this point that what the Israelis actually have very explicitly said, David Ivri, who is a legendary Israeli military, I think he reached the rank of general where he was in the Air Force. He was one of the pilots who struck the Osirak reactor in Iraq in 1981. I think he actually was the leading pilot. I remember having a lengthy conversation with him, and he made it very clear. Israel's definition of a threat is very different from that of other countries. Most countries define a threat as the capability, capacity times intent. In the Israeli case, they are assuming that intent is always there, it's always hostile, and as a result, the only thing you focus on is capability. So in order for Israel not to feel threatened, none of its neighbors are allowed to have a capability or to be so dependent that they cannot use any of those capabilities against Israel. That is, at the end of the day, a form. It's the pathway towards military hegemony. And we have seen now that once Assad fell, the first thing the Israelis did is that they went in and destroyed as much as possible of Syria's military capability to ensure that regardless of who comes to power afterwards, that regime cannot pose a threat to Israel. Now, one can perhaps say, well, this is understandable. Israel has been under threat, etc., and this is their doctrine. The problem is, if you actually want peace and you want stability, you cannot have a situation in which one country has absolute security and everyone else have to accept the insecurity of living next to a state that has absolute security, but they cannot have a deterrence against it. And if that wasn't challenging enough before, you can imagine how challenging that is going forward when that state actually is engaged in a genocide.
And strikes a US
and
ally.
strikes a US ally on top of that, which then tells these countries that the protection they thought that they had through an American security umbrella, implicit as it may be, nevertheless, is not valid in case the Israelis decide to strike.
I think people really underestimate the amount of damage that strike has caused the US. I think, you know, in your personal relationship, if you break someone's trust, a loved one's trust, it's very difficult to build that back up. Uh, they broke that trust for what? For striking a Hamas negotiating team. I worry as what the repercussions would be, and we're starting to see a lot of that. We're starting to see China kind of extend their arm to support those Gulf nations. They'll probably start filling that void more and more as they have over the last, 10, 15 years. We've seen that announcement of, I'm sure they've been negotiating it for a long time, but the Saudi-Pakistani pact was announced a week or two later. Can you maybe explain to the audience and to me really, what is Israel's military capabilities now? You've already hinted that Egypt is a lot weaker. How does it compare to Turkey? And how does it compare to Pakistan if Pakistan's are going to offer security for Saudi? And the reason I ask these questions is obviously I don't expect war between Israel and Turkey or Pakistan, Saudi, or Egypt. But I just want to understand if there's any level of military deterrence for Israel in the region whatsoever.
There still is.
Do we have, like, in the Middle Eastern region, do we have a multipolar world or unipolar world? Is there a hegemony like the US had over the
There
last few
is
decades?
no US hegemony any longer, I think, at this point. It is nevertheless, the US is obviously,
I meant the
yeah,
the previous
yeah.
hegemony,
The
obviously
US is
NATO.
obviously the most powerful military in the world. And certainly, if it decides to put its full military might in the Middle East, it would still win the military battles. But we have already seen how it can win decisive military battles in 2-3 weeks, take an entire country, and still lose dramatically afterwards. That's what happened in Iraq. In Afghanistan, the United States spent $2 trillion to change the regime from the Taliban to the Taliban. So military might is not sufficient to be able to say that, okay, this is going to bring you safety or it's going to bring stability in the region. In fact, during this period of American hegemony, in 1998, there were 5 military conflicts in the region. By 2020, it was 22. That's not all America's fault in any way, shape, or form, but many of them were derivatives of the instability caused by the invasion of Iraq. And that is something that the United States is responsible for. So military might in and of itself, I'm not saying that you shouldn't have it, but this blind resort only on that has not even served the superpower of the United States. And as a result, I'm very skeptical that it will serve Israel. And I think it's also very important to make a point here, which goes to your question. Israel is not really a superpower in its own might. It has military capabilities, undoubtedly, of course. But if the United States stops the arms sales, stops all the military equipment and ammunition, etc., one Israeli general already in November 2023 said the war would end in 5 days. So this is
Which war?
this was the war in Gaza.
War
So
with Iran?
this is at the time when they were attacking Gaza.
The war in Gaza
In
would end
5 days,
in
if the
Gaza.
United States stopped all of the military provisions that were.
So,
I mean,
wow.
look, Israel has an
Wow,
extremely
so
impressive high-tech industry, but the degree of ammunition and weapons and munitions and all things that are being used in the last 2 years is not something that Israel can produce on its own. And if you want to have this type, or just take the attacks against Iran, for instance, and perhaps this will be a segue to our Iran discussion. Absent American support in shooting down the Iranian missiles, not just intelligence, but using its own interceptors, Israel would have suffered even greater than what it did. The United States actually consumed 25% of all of its THAAD interceptors in those 12 days. And this is in a region that both the Biden administration and the Trump administration and the Obama administration said no longer is strategically vital to the United States. Yet it consumed 25% of its THAAD interceptors there. The war ended to a certain extent because the Israelis ran out of the Arrow 3 interceptors. The Iranians produced missiles faster than the US and Israel together actually produce interceptors, which is partly because the technology is so much more advanced than building missiles. So I think we have to keep in mind that this is not Israel being a military hegemon on its own. It is because of the backing of the United States. The United States has written in as a law to ensure that it never sells weapons that are technologically more advanced than what it sells Israel to anyone in the region. That is an American law, the qualitative strategic edge, meaning that the Turks are not getting anything that is as close to what the Israelis get. Only the Israelis get the absolute best in the region from the United States.
Wow. So that includes Turkey.
Yes,
When you say the region
it includes
includes Turkey, they don't supply Turkey the same
It includes Turkey.
level of military equipment
I mean,
as
just look at the
Israel.
fight
Wow.
that the Israelis have
A
been,
NATO member.
the Turks have been fighting for quite some time about the F-35s. UAE got them, the Turks have not yet quite got them. So this is, again, it's not to diminish that Israel has a tremendous amount of capabilities and had a lot of other successes, but to believe that Israel is a hegemon needs to be able to have that dominance on its own account. That is not what Israel is achieving right now.
So, based on what you're saying, you're pretty much implying that this is not Israel versus Iran. That was what we saw just now, a 12-day war between the US and Iran to an extent.
Absolutely.
And even in Gaza. This is not, if you want to call it a genocide, it will be a genocide or whatever you call the attack, the invasion by the US more than Israel. If, based on what you said, that it would have ended in 5 days without American support. So essentially, that's the US doing all this through Israel. Now, obviously, the US doesn't want to, the US is doing this because Israel's influence in the US and the amount of support it has among Americans. That's the reason it's getting that support. But that's a pretty important point.
I won't get into great details, but let me tell you that there was a conversation that brought about the first ceasefire. And that is because a representative of the US government made it very clear to Netanyahu that if he didn't sign this ceasefire before Trump became president, the United States would end all arms sales. The reason why, for the first time, efforts in the Senate to stop the arms sales actually have reached a point, I think the last vote got 27 or 29, which of course is not sufficient to pass that block. But nevertheless, 4 years ago, it wouldn't even have gotten one, is precisely because that is where the leverage of the United States lies.
So I feel like Israel's seeing that support from the US getting closer and closer to an end or a shift, and is trying to get as much progress as possible before that point. And that's what we're having. They're trying to eliminate all threats around them, trying to gain as much territory as possible, and trying to establish dominance as much as possible before they reach that timeline, because the support is waning. And people, not only voters, but also people within Congress are starting to oppose that support. We're seeing that split within MAGA. So one could argue that Israel's seeing that strategic shift, that fundamental shift, in the US. And that's why we're seeing so many, they've struck 9 countries since October 7th, most of them in the last couple of months, Yemen included, Tunisia included, that drone attack, if you want to count that in. So that's Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Yemen, Iran, Iraq. I don't know what I missed. And you put the Tunisia one, probably 1 or 2 more.
No, yeah,
Qatar.
Well, yeah.
We missed Qatar.
That's the most decisive one.
Yeah, so
impactful.
Yeah,
one,
so let's go to the
one point on what you just said there. I think this is actually
this.
becoming an increasingly common view, that this is part of the calculation on the Israeli side. There was a leak that was published by DropSite that revealed that the Israelis had, I think they had outsourced it to one of these American consulting firms to make an assessment of the impact of all of this to Israel's broader standing. And it was very clear cut that Israel is so much more isolated. The trend lines are all in the wrong direction. And the only thing the Israelis essentially could do, or that was recommended for them to do, was to counter this, was to fuel as much Islamophobia as possible, because that is the thing that the calculation there would be able to shift the opinion base in many different countries. Whether that is what they're doing, and I don't know, I'm just telling you what that report essentially said, the recommendation to the Israeli government. So I think there's a common view that they are recognizing that this is going to be much, much more difficult to sustain a couple of years from now. So whatever they can achieve now, not just because public opinion, but also because in Trump now they have a president that in many ways could have, the spectrum of options are so much greater. He could have gone for a full deal with the Iranians, but he could also have gone for a military strike against the Iranians and perhaps even war. Whereas with Biden, he didn't see the political will to actually strike a deal, and also not the political will to move towards military strikes. But with Trump, they have that. And now when they are essentially very happy to see him in a position in which he's greenlighting a lot of different things, I think they're taking advantage of that as much as possible to achieve as much as possible, because they know that window will close.
Which includes another war with Iran. I think Iran's preparing for a war. I've interviewed some from the country that said the war hasn't ended and they're waiting for phase two. And it goes to your point. If I want to ask you, one of my questions is why. But the answer seems pretty evident that they have a small window, especially before the midterm elections, to strike Iran before it's too late, number one. And number two, militarily. Iran is rebuilding pretty quickly, getting the support from China, supplying them, not weapons yet, but I think all the material to build weapons, and obviously Russia. And they're rebuilding quicker than many expected. So based on those two factors, if Israel wants to strike Iran again, for whatever reason, which we'll dig into and I'll get your thoughts on it, in my opinion, it would be by the end of this year.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And let me give you a couple of reasons as to why I think the Israelis want to do this. In my assessment, the Israelis had three key objectives with their strike in June. One of them was successful, the two others were not. The one that was successful is that they finally managed to get the United States to get into a direct military confrontation with Iran. For more than 20 years, particularly Prime Minister Netanyahu himself has led the charge on the Israeli side to get the United States into that war because of the challenge that Iran poses to Israel, and because only the United States has the power to shift the balance in the region by weakening Iran dramatically in a direction favorable to Israel. Israel itself does not have that power. At least it didn't in the past 20 years. But now it finally succeeded. I think they were disappointed that Trump only did a one-off. They were hoping that he would go in more fully in the war and take out a lot of Iran's conventional military capabilities as well. Trump chose to only strike at the nuclear sites. The two other objectives, however, were not successful. The first one there was to decapitate the regime, essentially do the same thing they had successfully done to the leadership of Hezbollah. Hezbollah is still there, but it was nevertheless dramatically weakened. This is not a regime change operation. I think it's important to understand the difference. Regime change means that you change the regime from something to something else, to another regime. A regime collapse or decapitation operation means that you just take it out. You don't take responsibility for what comes afterwards. In fact, you may be quite content with nothing following and instead having chaos and civil war. Now, they were tremendously successful in the first hours of that war. They killed more than 20 senior Iranian military officials, their families, as well as, I think, 19 scientists that were all playing crucial roles in the nuclear program, and their families as well, which is not that often mentioned in the media. And they thought that by that, they would decapitate the regime and they would disrupt Iran's command and control. But very quickly, all of these people were replaced, and within 12 hours, the Iranians started shooting large barrages of missiles back at Israel. And it turned out that they had not been decapitated, and the resilience of the government was stronger than the Israelis had expected. The New Washington Post actually published something that I thought was quite fascinating, and I think gives us a little bit more granular detail of what happened and the resilience. During the first hours of that attack, when they had immediately succeeded in killing a large number of the military officials, Mossad agents with absolutely perfect Farsi were calling up the Iranian generals and were telling them, you have 12 hours to send us a video on this Telegram address, essentially saying that you're giving up and you're leaving the country and that you're defecting. If you don't, we will kill you and we will kill your family. The tapes were published by the Washington Post. We will kill you and we will kill your family. And this is happening in the midst of that early stages of a very successful attack in which many of them had been killed. So this is not afterwards when the Iranians had kind of managed to get back in control. This is at the height of them being totally surprised by this attack. They made about 20 of those calls. To the best of our knowledge, not a single one of those generals defected or sent in any of those videos. So the resilience was something that took them by surprise. The third objective is the most important one. It goes back to our discussion about Lebanon and Syria. I think they were hoping, and their goal is, to turn Iran into the next Syria or the next Lebanon, a country that at the end of the day, Israel can strike at will, with impunity, and without American support. In Syria and Lebanon, they have that capability. They have that total dominance. With Iran, they couldn't even do this attack without the US. And I think they fully understood this is not something they were going to achieve with one attack. But I think they had expected that they would have achieved more with this first attack than they did. And I think part of the reason why they didn't was because the cost the Iranians were inflicting on the Israelis with their missile responses, which were actually quite successful, particularly towards the end of the war, in which a larger and larger number of these missiles actually penetrated and hit Israel. Israeli military censorship does not allow us to have a full understanding of the scope of those attacks. But over time, more and more has come out, and the picture is starting to become clear that this was quite damaging. I don't think the Israelis were, going to give up or anything like that. I'm not saying that they lost the war or anything like that. But I do think that they would have been happy to continue to absorb a lot of those hits if the US had stayed in the war. But without the US staying in the war, the cost-benefit analysis of continuing changed dramatically, and they agreed to a ceasefire. But having started this goes to the points you were making. They cannot afford to stop, because the more time they give the Iranians, the more they will rebuild their defense systems, the more they will build missiles, the more they may actually get better defense systems from Chinese and others, and the more they may actually have some success in rooting out the Mossad presence inside of Iran, which clearly was massive and took the Iranians by huge surprise. And then, as you pointed out, once you get into the midterm elections, that season may start as soon as December or January. It's not that it's prohibitive, but it makes it so much more complicated, because it will be more difficult to know where will Trump be on this. And as a result, I do think that their plan was to do something before December. It may still be their plan. The one thing that may potentially have changed the calculation is the political and military failure of the attack on Doha that has really backfired on Israel. That may change the calculation, but it's too early to tell.
That was such a stupid attack. That was such and obviously I don't know what I don't know, but that attack just does not make sense. Obviously, there's one argument that could be made that could give it logic, is they don't want peace so they can continue their plans in Gaza. And my position is that Hamas was seriously looking into, considering how much intelligence Israel has, Hamas was really looking into the peace proposal by Trump, and there was a possibility that they would accept that.
Well, they did actually. They accepted it on several occasions, and the Israelis pulled back. I think the answer to it, actually, Mario, is pretty simple. The Israelis, and at least this Netanyahu government, doesn't want that peace, because the minute the war ends, his political challenges at home are going to quadruple, including a potential jail sentence. This is openly discussed in Israel. So I don't think it is a miscalculation in many different ways. But if you want to ruin the relationship between Qatar and the US, and if you want to kill the negotiations in a much more prolonged way, this strike would have done it had it been successful. Instead, it backfired.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of an article I've got it open here back in 2023. That's on the Jerusalem Post. Hamas says it will release all civilian hostages. Okay, so that's civilian. So obviously, maybe some military hostages, some soldiers won't be released if IDF stops strikes. That was on October 17th, 2023, 10 days after October 7th. So the war could have been ended days after October 7th.
Right.
And
multiple times after that. And also, perhaps most importantly, Trump got a 3-phase ceasefire. Netanyahu made it clear from the outset that he said it publicly to his audience at home that he was never going to go to phase 2. He would stop at phase 1. Conversations we had with the administration made it clear that the administration was confident that phase 2 would be reached, but they were more uncertain about phase 3. We never got to phase 2 because Netanyahu just decided to end and violate the ceasefire. So we have overwhelming evidence that he's not looking for a ceasefire, he's not looking for a peace. And as a result, it is not as mysterious as to why he did that attack. What I think is perhaps surprising to all of us is the audacity that he would actually strike a US ally in the midst of negotiations that Israel itself was involved in. Of course, it had struck Iran in the midst of a negotiation that the US was involved in, but to do so with the very same people that it was actually negotiating with right now, it was obviously something that was so audacious that it took everyone by surprise.
Yeah, and I was just looking for the quotes here. You saw me look down. Quotes by former U.S. State Department spokesman Matt Miller came on Channel 13 interview. You saw that interview, yeah?
Yeah,
That's just
yeah,
heartbreaking to see. Some things he said the U.S. wanted deals more than Israel, according to him. Again, that's the former U.S. State Department spokesman who was saying that Hamas, they're the reason for all this. Well, he came out. He was on the
yeah.
Biden, obviously. He came out and says the U.S. wanted deals more than Israel, which added conditions or changed them to make it harder. And then he says, before the 2024 Rafah invasion, Israel agreed to a 6-week ceasefire, but Netanyahu publicly stated Israel would invade regardless, removing Hamas's incentive. So essentially, there was a
Yeah.
ceasefire that was being reached. But then after these comments by Netanyahu, which made those comments after realizing that a ceasefire could lead to an
And
end to the
the
war,
ceasefire, yeah,
removed Hamas's incentive. And
and the
go
ceasefire
ahead.
that was agreed upon just days before or day before Trump took office was the same ceasefire that was on the table in July. Israel could have achieved it then. It would
Yeah.
have gotten more of its hostages out because they would have been alive. I mean, this is part of the reason. One of the big missing stories, all of this, is that outside media is not covering what's going on inside of Israel, particularly the struggles of the families of the hostages who have been protesting so ferociously because they feel that the government for more than a year now has completely abandoned them.
Yeah. There's a comment that Matt Miller makes, that in a meeting with Blinken, Netanyahu said the following about the war: "You are right. We are going to be fighting this war for decades to come." It's kind of concerning, considering what he's saying. That I don't think that's sustainable, with international sentiment shifting so quickly in all these countries recognizing the state of Palestine. But going to Iran and how fast they're rebuilding right now. Can you tell us about their military capabilities now compared to pre-12-day war, and how fast do you think they'll be able to replenish their ballistic missile stocks, for example, and the air defense systems?
So this is the big $64 million question, essentially. And I would perhaps rephrase it as this, at least when it comes to what's going to happen in the next war, is who's going to learn faster and who is going to be able to act faster, Israel or Iran? Will the Israelis be able to learn more and faster about why did the Iranians manage to break through their air defense system so many times? Will they be able to patch those holes faster than the Iranians? Further, will figure out the weaknesses of Israel's air defense systems and other ways in which they could do so. Towards the end of the war, the Iranians had become more effective in shooting missiles in ways that made it more and more difficult for the Israelis or the Americans to detect them and be able to move the missile launchers much faster than before. They had also learned much more on how to use cyber attacks simultaneously with the missile attacks to take out the air defense systems, even only for 2 or 3 seconds, which is exactly the amount of time that you need. So this is very much about who's going to learn the most. Then you have the hardware, which you're pointing to. I don't think we know. We don't know if they're going to be able to rebuild all of their launchers as fast. I assume that the launchers is probably much easier. The estimate of the intelligence services is that the Iranians still have about 1,600 long distance ballistic missiles in their stockpile. They used about 500 in this war. And I think one thing we should also understand about the potential next war, which I unfortunately feel is very, very likely, is that in the first war, the Iranians appear to have played the long game. They were not shooting all the missiles that they could. Some reduction in their missile attacks was clearly because of successes that the Israelis had in taking out launchers and other things. But some of it was also because the Iranians were playing the longer game. They did not think that this is going to be a short war. They thought that they had to outlast the Israelis, so they were hoarding a lot of their missiles. In the next war, I suspect that their strategy will be very different because they will most likely conclude that they have to very quickly inflict a significant amount of damage on Israel in order to dispel any notion in Israel that Iran can be turned into the next Syria or to the next Lebanon. And it is because the only deterrence Iran at this point really has, because clearly their air defense systems were not much, the only real deterrence they have is their offensive capability, their ability to inflict pain on Israel if Israel attacks. So I suspect and I fear that the next war will be a much more intense, high casualty event from the very outset. And particularly if you have high casualty incidents and events on the Israeli side, that will dramatically increase the pressure on the United States to get much fully into the war. And that will then also be a very different war than the attack that Trump did, because that was a one-off. It was very limited. In essentially, the US was at war for about a day. That's it. And part of the reason why some of those other scenarios that many had predicted, myself included, did not come about was precisely because this wasn't that war. It wasn't a full-scale invasion. It wasn't a full-scale bombing campaign against the entire country. It was a targeted hit against specific places, and as a result, the Iranians chose not to counter-escalate. But if there is a much larger attack, then the Iranians are likely going to use whatever they have and probably not save them for another day, because there may not be another day.
How involved do you think the US will be in a
I
second
think
war?
the deeper this goes into the midterms, it will be more and more challenging for Trump. MAGA was not happy with this, but the reason why he got away with it essentially is precisely because it was a very quick event. No Americans died. This was not a forever war. It was not one of those things in which at the outset the exit ramp had not been identified. That's the problem with all of these previous American wars. They're so the objectives are so maximalist. There's no clear plan for victory. There's no clear plan on how you find a face-saving exit if you have to. So they end up going on for years and years and years. And that's something that the American public in general, but the MAGA base in particular, has become very sensitive to. That was not what happened in July. We should not misread that and think, oh, MAGA is totally okay with the war, because the next war may be very, very
Yeah.
different. And then their reaction, I suspect, will be very, very
Right.
different. And I think that the Trump administration
Yeah, you can't
understands that.
blame them. You can't blame them. Trump came in saying he'll end the
Exactly.
Ukraine war very quickly, and he can end the war in Gaza as well. He wants a Nobel Peace Prize. But then now we're looking at the Ukraine war. We saw the U-turn he did on Ukraine. That came as a surprise to many. And we're seeing the war in the Middle East expand, and now Qatar being struck. So I think that Russia continuing the war in Ukraine, obviously I want the war to Ukraine to end more than many, but Russia continuing that war in Ukraine is one could look at it as a strategic advantage for Iran, because they're spreading the US thin, not allowing the US to be able to support Israel in another war to the same extent they possibly did in that 12-day war. Because now a lot of people are saying that the US does not even have the capacity to support Ukraine if they chose to be able to win this war, to at least have some sort of advancements.
That's the problem of these
With that
endless
current
wars. I mean, it just
capacity,
completely depletes you. And it erases any ability to make strategic prioritization.
it is sad to see what the US empire has done to itself. Now, I hope I'm wrong in some way, but every person I speak to, even those that are very pro NATO, pro US, anti Iran, anti Russia, it's hard to it's hard to ignore the how thinly stretched the US military is, and how well China's playing all this. China's strategy in not getting involved, but also supporting the right countries to keep spreading the US thin and keep those wars ongoing. You know, China played a big role in Russia's economy doing so well. And China's played a key role along with Russia in supporting Iran. Um, we're moving faster and faster into that multipolar world. And what's really fascinating and just perplexing is that it seems that I thought, after the Iraq and Afghanistan war, the lessons have been learned. It's almost suicidal to see that the same strategy is ongoing, to see the war in Ukraine to continue the way it is, and to see the Middle East how it is today. Can you maybe explain where you see China in all this, especially in the Middle East?
I think that's a great question, because, and you hinted at it, China has played its cards very cleverly. China has managed to stay out of the troubles of the region, have excellent relations with Iran, with the UAE, with Qatar, and with Saudi all at the same time. They have their quarrels, and China stays way clear of them. Even has excellent relations with Israel and with Iran and with the Palestinians. And he has led with his economy, and has not been pushing a military agenda. It has not offered to be a security guarantor to anyone. And as a result, some of these fears that exist in Washington, which is, oh, if the US leaves the region, the Chinese will come in and take over. I don't think the Chinese are that dumb. I don't think they're looking at military hegemony in the Middle East and feeling envious. In fact, I would not wish military hegemony in the Middle East to my worst enemy. It is not a valuable thing to have. I think history is quite clear. If the United States, with all of its military power, nevertheless suffered so tremendously by pursuing that hegemony, then others will suffer even more because they don't have the same margins that the US has. And we have unfortunately wasted much of those margins. What I think has happened now, though, or will happen now, is not that the Chinese are going to come in and say, hey, rely on us on security. Instead, they will recognize that the Gulf states cannot afford to break with the United States. In fact, I think part of the reason why you're seeing the Qataris almost exonerating the Trump administration for the Israeli attack, even though it is the American air defense systems that seem to have gone to sleep mysteriously, is because they recognize Israel wants Qatar and the US to have a very negative break in their relationship, and they're not going to allow for that. So they're essentially exonerating the Trump administration, and they're keeping it classy on the surface level. They're going to continue to have that relationship, obviously, but underneath it, they're going to diversify. They're going to go to other countries. We already saw that the Saudis made this deal with the Pakistanis. How much substance behind it, I don't know. But I do think there was an intent there to send a signal to the United States. Because who is Pakistan relying on for weapons? China. So going to Pakistan is to essentially to say, hey, we're moving in the direction, or we can move in the direction of China. We're not going all the way. We're going to one of the pit stops, essentially. And the Chinese, one GCC officials told me, has offered and come and said, look, we have all of these different air defense systems, and you can feel comfortable with them because neither the US nor we can turn them off, which is a hint that the United States actually has the ability to turn off all of the different air defense systems that is provided the GCC states. I wouldn't be surprised if that is the direction these countries will go. They will not break with the US. That would be foolish of them. But they would also be very foolish of them to put all of their security eggs in the American basket, given what happened. And given what I hinted at earlier on, that the US has taken off all of the constraints on Israel. I mean, I said this already before the Qatar strike. I said this a year ago, that if you're sitting in the GCC and you've been worried about Iran for quite some time, and rightfully so in many different ways, and you have all of these defenses against Iran that you bought from the US, but now you're seeing that with all of these restrictions lifted on Israel, you have to start worrying about what that could mean for your security. Because if Israel is allowed to do whatever it wants with with full impunity, then it would be very foolish not to be worried about that. And apparently they weren't worried enough, and we saw that this happened. After this, I think there will be diversification in many of these different places. They have no other choice.
Yeah, I think that Saudi announcement is pretty consequential. We're talking about Saudi, probably America's biggest ally in the Gulf region. For now, can you give me your thoughts on that pact? Because we haven't really spoken about it. So I want to wrap it up by talking about the Saudi-Pakistani defense agreement, which is kind of like an Arab NATO, along with the meeting between all the Arab nations in Qatar after the Qatar strike. I think there's been talk about some sort of Arab alliance or Muslim alliance, I think called Arab alliance, not Muslim alliance, as a way to deter Israel. Could we see the structure of the Middle East, all these different alliances that are there, kind of being strengthened, all the rivalries being put aside in order to build that strong deterrence against Israel? And I'm talking here about Iran, Saudi, for example, or even Qatar and UAE, Saudi were all in Qatar, having the close relationship. Remember, these were rivals not long ago. So, I'd love to get your thoughts on those two things.
I think we will see that. I think again, without necessarily undoing the other agreements that exist. I don't think the Saudis are going to give up these implicit security guarantees they have from the US in order to just rely on Pakistan. That's not going to happen. What they're going to do is to have both, and perhaps a third one or a fourth one. It will be diversification. There will be movement in various ways towards something to make sure that there is some sort of a structure that also balances Israel. I have to say, though, that I am not enthusiastic about this, because to what I see is just musical chairs. For 30 years, the region was organized against Iran. Earlier on, it was against Iran and Iraq. And now we're playing musical chairs. So now the GCC will kind of mend fences with Iran in order to ally and balance against Israel. And then something else happens, and then they will shift it around over and over again. Ultimately, it doesn't provide durable security. What they should do, in my view, is to recognize it absolutely cannot be like an Islamic NATO or an Arab NATO, because it shouldn't be a NATO to begin with, and I'll explain why. And it shouldn't be like, oh, you have to have this ethnicity or this religion to be able to be part of it, because that just divides
That gets
the
dirty.
region in ways that guarantees conflict. But also, just the NATO idea, I think, is highly problematic, because NATO was created against another threat. But after a while, as we have now seen, once that threat is significantly diminished, the organization kind of loses its raison d'etre. So either it crumbles, it is allowed to crumble, or it has to invent a new threat just to continue to exist. And so it doesn't allow you to get out of the security dilemma. It necessitates a continuation of a threat in order for the alliances to exist. Let me give you an example. In 1973, you had the war between Israel and the Arab states, and Iran, which was a de facto ally of Israel at the time, under the Shah, actually played a role in which it was helping the Arab side much more than the Israelis. And the Israelis were very upset about this. And they were wondering what was going on, and they were starting to have deep doubts about the relationship with Iran, which was crucial for them at the time. I interviewed an Iranian diplomat from that time, from the era of the Shah, and explained it very well. He said, look, once the Shah was in a position of strength and he had the opportunity to actually overcome the tensions between Iran and the Arab states. In that specific case, it was with Egypt. Now, when Sadat had taken over, Nasser was gone, there was this deep rapprochement between Egypt and Iran. So once Iran had the ability to make friends with the Arabs, it was not going to say, I'm going to keep enmity with the Arabs in order to have Israel as a friend. My objective is to have more friends. So I'm not going to say no to new friendships in order to keep another one, and keep enmities in order to keep another friend. So the Shah moved in a direction in which he tried to have good relations with Israel and the Arabs at the same time. If you go for a NATO and you're organizing the region against half the region against the other half, you're just ensuring that conflict will erupt eventually. What you need to do is transition to collective security and make sure that you have an inclusive security body and architecture, which ultimately must include Israel as well, because Israel is there in the region and you have to incorporate it. I personally think, however, and the proposal we have produced where I work is one in which Israel's inclusion has to be guaranteed, but the ticket price for Israel to be included, together with Iran, Turkey, and all of these other states, is for there to also be a Palestinian state. That is the threshold that Israel needs to meet in order for it to be included, and by that get the strongest security guarantees that ever has been offered, because this would be more than the Arab Peace Plan of 2002 that offered recognition. It would be more than the Abraham Accord that offered normalization. This is full security integration and inclusion. But for that to happen, there cannot be a genocide, and there must be a Palestinian state.
Yeah, I don't see that happening. Trita, I'll end it with one last question as we wrap up: is where do you see the Middle East by the end of Trump's term?
It's a great question. It is extremely difficult to make a prediction for a very simple reason.
Especially for the Middle East.
Especially because the president is Trump. As you just mentioned earlier on, you saw an 180 on Ukraine just last week. So things can change so dramatically because the most powerful state, still not a unipolar power any longer, but still the most powerful state in the world, is in a position in which it wants to be unpredictable. It wants to do things that constantly surprises. And as a result, it's very difficult to make those predictions because it very much depends on how many Diet Cokes Trump may have that specific morning.
Okay. But just on that, was it really unpredictable what he did in Ukraine? Isn't it predictable as part of his negotiating tactic? Pressures one side, pressures the other, good cop, bad cop. It's like, I found it to be surprising, but also not that unpredictable, in my opinion, at least when it comes to Ukraine. But we'll leave that for another day. I think it's
if it reverts back again, then perhaps you're right. But if this actually ends up being a new line and suddenly him saying that the Ukrainians actually can't take territory, then I think we will have seen something that was unpredictable and quite surprising.
I agree. Trita,
thank you so much for having me, Mario. I really appreciate it.
It's a great chat. We should do it.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
You too.
Have a good day.